The honourable member from Charlottetown, Belvedere.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to take a moment to first thank the many civil servants in the Department of Finance and across government who have worked hard over the past weeks and months to develop this budget. It's an unenviable task to have to make a fiscal plan for a faint-hearted government party with no vision, little compassion, and a complete inability to make the changes that Islanders need. Mr. Speaker, provincial budgets are aspirational documents. They tell a story. They tell a story about what the government of the day sees as its vision for the province. Unfortunately, those stories often amount to little more than words. It's okay. Thank you. It means I can lean on it. This story asks us to find the real test of leadership. The test of leadership is whether these aspirations are followed up by action. And that's a test that this Premier and his government have utterly failed. We hope that all the initiatives in this latest budget don't have to be announced, re-announced, re-announced again, and again, like the new Sherwood School was before work finally started on it this year, or like the dental programme, or like midwifery, or the new mental health hospital. Sadly, unless it's something that this government can throw money at using a surprise surplus that they magically find every year, the need is left unmet and Islanders are abandoned, Mr. Speaker. It seems if you have to actually plan for it or do some hard work, forget it. It's beyond their ability. Not to mention, there's probably no political points to be scored. And let's be clear, most of the promises made in this budget won't even break ground before the next election. So which of these promises in today's budget will be ignored or forgotten? Given the spotty record over the term of this government, it's a fair question that Islanders deserve to know the answer to. Let's talk about budget promises. One would think that if you're actually putting money in the budget for some programme or project, it would be a sure thing. But over and over, this government has proven it is not. When government asked for our input into this budget, our feedback was quite simple. Why don't you do what you've already promised you would and you haven't done yet? Our list was full of all sorts of initiatives that this government has promised and failed to deliver. They have not made substantial progress on the construction of the mental health campus, especially the Hillsborough Hospital replacement. Adding air conditioning units for all patient areas and rooms at the Hillsborough Hospital, replacing the Summerside Harbourside Medical Centre building, repairing or replacing Kings County Memorial Hospital, beginning the construction of the new school in Stratford, improving ventilation in island schools, especially for those without mechanical ventilation. This is just a short list. It's pages long. So what are our thoughts about this current budget, this 2023-2024 capital budget? No surprise. Paving is #1 spending priority for this government. This budget plans to spend $240 million in the next 5 years on highways and bridges. And on top of that, this government has consistently underestimated and overspent in this area. Special warrants for paving are pretty much as predictable as a spring thaw. Compare this to the next big-ticket item, mental health, which is an area that this government consistently underspends. Here they are saying they'll spend $174 million over 5 years. That's $65 million less than the entire paving commitment. Or how about the third big-ticket item, housing? It's another area where this government cannot seem to manage to spend the full amount budgeted year after year. For housing, an area this government has just now finally admitted is a crisis of its own making, government is only willing to commit $161 million over 5 years. That's $80 million less than it would spend on highways and pavement. We do not have a paving crisis. We have a housing crisis. And while highway spending stays more or less constant over the next 5 years, we're happy making that commitment long-term. Housing spending is going to fall off a cliff in the next few years. We need stable and consistent long-term investment into housing if we want to have a meaningful impact on our island housing market. 31 new units in Summerside? Are you kidding? There are 25 people who are going to be homeless in Summerside in 2 weeks. That's almost the entire commitment that you're thinking is exciting for Summerside.
It's not.
We need hundreds and thousands of units, not 31. The only reason we need to have such a big spend on housing in this budget is because governments, not just this one, but previous ones as well, will give you that. You have failed for years to invest in housing. Don't pat yourselves on the back, neither side. This is only starting to make up. We are only now beginning to make up for years of outright negligence, Mr. Speaker. This negligence has cost Irelanders dearly. It's not just cost them economically, it's cost their health and their well-being. And looking at the timidness of this budget, it will continue to cost them and us dearly for years to come. Mr. Speaker, after all, this is the government that left Clifford Lee, the housing hub czar, in charge of development for almost a year after they were elected, and we don't know to this day what he did, if anything, for that six-figure salary. This is the government that didn't even bother to apply for the Federal Rapid Housing Initiative that offered 90% federal funding for essential local housing projects, and we didn't put an application in. This is the government that has invested in new student housing but is totally okay with leaving it empty until next fall so they can provide accommodations for 2 weeks for the Canada Games. This is the government that has actively contributed to the housing crisis by failing to act on short-term rental regulation, failing to act on a rental registry, failing to act on essential repairs and maintenance on the properties they own and they run, failing to act on the critical need for emergency shelters and transitional housing, failing to act on homelessness, simply and completely failing to act. There have been years of inaction on housing, Mr. Speaker, predating this administration, but yesterday we heard for the first time government admitting that what we have known and said out loud for years, that an aggressive population growth strategy without an associated plan for housing, healthcare and education is a recipe for disaster. The time to act was 5, 10, 15 years ago, but the second best option is now. To quote C.S. Lewis, if you are on the wrong road, progress means doing an about turn and walking back to the right road. And in that case, the one who turns back soonest is the most progressive. I guess we may have finally found that person in this government's caucus. It's a shame about the rest of them. This government has consistently underspent the budgeted amount for housing in most of its last fiscal years, and today's capital budget forecasts an underspend yet again on housing construction for 2022-23. Mr. Speaker, with an ageing workforce, we risk not having enough skilled tradespeople to meet the need for more housing. And we're worried that government has not treated this labour shortage challenge with the attention it deserves. But that means that government has a story ready to go when they fail to meet the targeted new housing builds. But this is not an acceptable excuse, Mr. Speaker. There are plenty of creative ways to address housing shortages without the limited scope of traditional box building. What could that look like, Mr. Speaker? It's not rocket science. It could include investment in the capital budget for existing housing acquisition, which would open up access to federal funding programs that we have not yet tapped. This government can and should be leveraging federal funding programs and the Housing Corporation assets. We own 1,600 housing units, Mr. Speaker. We can leverage those and the value that they contain to buy existing multi-unit commercial properties like the Causeway Bay Motel, to convert commercial space to residential, to invest in modular homes, prefab homes and tiny homes and the associated regulatory changes that they require, and to purchase existing rental properties as they come on the market. The Minister of Social Development and Housing said just yesterday that we need 1,400 units a year just to begin to address the housing shortfall in the province. And honestly, Mr. Speaker, I think that's an underestimate because we're already so far behind. It is critical that this government expand its inventory of public housing from its current 1,600 units. As it stands, this failure to think creatively means that your commitment, this government's commitment of 465 new public housing builds over 5 years, while historic, is less than 100 units a year. How is that going to help, Mr. Speaker? Every person that gets a home is going to value that home, but, Mr. Speaker, that's the entirety of our waiting list right now. Mr. Speaker, regarding healthcare, how could we forget the infamous shovels in the ground on day one that the Premier promised for our mental health hospital? Unfortunately, the trend of announcing key health initiatives with zero follow-through has become a trend with this government. For the 5th straight year in a row, we have millions invested in mental health capital. It's remarkable that this government will head into the next election having failed to deliver on its central campaign promise from 2019. Well, 2 promises if you count carbon pricing. Year over year, this government has failed islanders by failing to deliver on these critical health projects. Government says that healthcare is a top priority, but let's be clear, when your actions fall short for islanders struggling every day to get care, and for healthcare workers feeling burnt out and disrespected while keeping the system together, it's little more than another story. We do not underspend on pavement or fail to complete road projects, Mr. Speaker. If healthcare was a priority for this government, the promised health clinics and hospital upgrades would be up and running by now. If health and wellness was a priority for this government, then they would have learned from COVID and invested into our long-term care infrastructure already. There's money in this budget for construction and renovations to clinics and hospitals across the island, but these are largely the same promises that were made in last year's budget and the year before. I'll believe it when I see it, Mr. Speaker, and so will the thousands of islanders who have no family doctor and nowhere to turn for their day-to-day healthcare needs. Mr. Speaker, we are way past the point of needing major investment in climate change, both to reduce emissions and to prepare for the changes that are now inevitable. Yet this government continues to rely only on words and tinkering around the edges. We have yet to see a commitment to the transformative change that we know must come. Emergency preparedness is more than generators at fire halls. Welcome as they are, we should be providing money to retrofit community centres to be fully accessible emergency warming shelters with generators or solar panels with battery storage, washrooms, shower facilities, kitchens. We are going to need them sooner than we want. Mr. Speaker, what would our priorities be? Paving is great to have. We need to get from A to B. I mean, we need those roads, but a responsible government will be providing for people's basic needs first. That's what it means to be about people. Everybody needs shelter to survive. It is a human right that far too many people in PEI are struggling with. So housing must be a top priority, and 465 units doesn't cut it. You should be spending more on housing than paving. Healthcare is critical to the well-being of islanders. You should be spending more on healthcare than paving. Building and preparing for the new and evolving climate reality also needs to be a high priority. We're starting to see some baby steps in this direction, but given that we're decades behind where we need to be, this isn't enough. We should be spending more on adapting to climate change than paving. Our economy succeeds when people are safe, healthy, and housed. We need more than a story. We need action. Instead, all we're getting is another tall tale from this tired Tory government.